In this lecture, we'll be going a little bit more into depth into the Minoan culture, which is the second of the three Bronze Age peoples that we'll be looking at in the Aegean Sea. By about 3000 BCE, Bronze Age people are living on the island of Crete, and this is where the Minoan culture blossoms. This is the largest island in the Aegean Sea. It's more or less economically self-sufficient because they could harvest grain, olives, fruit, and they herded sheep and cattle here. They did not, however, have bronze, so they had to import this, and that meant they had the need to go outside of Crete for some of the most valuable materials. And their positioning in the Aegean Sea meant that they could become trade partners with other surrounding places like Greece, Egypt, the Near East, and Anatolia. They had lots of sea harbors, and they began to dominate in trade thanks to their strength as a seafaring people, but also their advantageous position in the Aegean Sea. By 1900 BCE, the Minoan culture starts to emerge in Crete. And we do call it the Minoan culture, but that's not what they would have been known by themselves, not what they would have called themselves. They are known this because of the legendary King Minos, and they were given this title by Sir Arthur Evans, the archaeologist who made many discoveries in Crete. And here is Knossos, which is thought to be the palace of King Minos. They had a written language, Linear A, which we don't know much about. Later, Linear B, which has some similarities to early Greek, was translated. But this is a language that was mainly used for trade. So we see records of inventory and trade records, but not necessarily cultural language, unlike, say, the Egyptians who used hieroglyphics to pretty much write down everything. This becomes a language that's mainly used for administration. And as I said, we could translate it by the early 1950s, and as Dr. Schertz told us in the last lecture, it was really the code breakers of World War II that contributed to this. It's hard to talk about the Minoan culture without acknowledging the central role that Sir Arthur Evans played in knowing who they are. And here I'm showing you an image of Sir Arthur himself, who was the primary archaeologist of Knossos. Today we know that DNA proves that the Minoans and the later Mycenaean descended from Neolithic farmers from Anatolia. So that's where they came from. We also know that the Minoans then intermingled and became the Mycenaeans, who would later supplant them in this region. But Sir Arthur Evans is really responsible for reconstructing a major site in Crete called Knossos. And we'll see that his type of archaeology, and when we talk about 19th century archaeology, we have to be really careful because a lot of liberties were taken. There isn't kind of the respect and carefulness that modern day archaeologists have for maintaining a site, and rather they were more interested in reconstructing a site so that we could get a sense of what it looked like, but not necessarily leaving things where they were. And so this reconstruction involved a lot of guesswork on the part of Sir Arthur Evans. And we see that when we look at the woman with snakes, the snake goddess that was found in the Palace of Knossos. It was found in a courtyard in Knossos with a large cache of other materials, other goods. It is about 1 foot tall, and it's made out of faience, or maiolica is another word for it, which is a particular kind of ceramics that's made from sand. So when it's fired, the silicon in the sand kind of melts, and it is almost self-glazing. So we have this beautiful sort of sheen and frostiness to the surface of the object. In its time, as it would be now, because of the material, it's considered a very valuable object, or an elite object, one that would only be commissioned and made for people of a certain status. But one thing that we need to acknowledge is that much of it has been reconstructed. In fact, the entire head, and you can kind of see here, well, you can very clearly see here, a line where the head has been basically planted right onto a body. The entire head is reconstructed. And again, this is entirely guesswork, what it might have looked like. In fact, here's a little bit better of a picture. You can see that the head is a separate piece, and this is what it might have looked like before the restoration by Evans. What came down to us is a figure, clearly a female figure, with an open shirt and bared breasts, missing one arm that we might assume is a pretty good mirroring of the other arm, but then the head is entirely absent. Now, when I describe Sir Arthur Evans as an archaeologist, I'm perhaps being a bit generous. He wasn't a professional archaeologist guided by the same ethical standards and guidelines that modern-day archaeologists have, but rather a wealthy, educated enthusiast with a passion for Homer, who was looking for the sites of King Minos and Knossos. And indeed, he did indeed find a very valuable site with some tremendously interesting objects that we learn so much about Minoan culture from. But the impulse to complete an incomplete object was clearly a driving force in intervening in an object like this. So let's think about where the choices might have come from. It wasn't Sir Arthur Evans, but rather a follower or student of his that completed this object. And his choice, I think, to include a head that had this very curious hat with a feline figure or a leopard on top is particularly interesting. Their choice to complete this object, meaning the head and the other arm, was probably informed by other figures that they found on Crete near the site that could be dated back to 6000 BCE. Even though this was called a goddess with snake by Evans, we don't have any indication that there was in fact a snake goddess, but there might have been other female figures that were holding snakes in control of nature, perhaps a guardian figure or associated with regeneration. The snakes certainly were associated with the underworld and might have been referencing Minoan mythology. Now, where does the cat hat come from? This seems to be entirely invented, but perhaps as referencing a Minoan female figure that was associated with animals and controlling nature, and the combination of the snakes with the cat might reference this kind of almost nymph-like presence. Other traditional figures were found that showed that female figures were depicted with an open bodice, a corset that cinches the waist, and a flouncy skirt with an apron that ends in layers of fabric.